Well, welcome everybody to our discussion on steps to cope. I'm Jill Vellerman and I'm a 5-step trainer and assessor. And I'd like to welcome our panel. We have Ed Seipler, who's a health development specialist in alcohol and drugs at the South Eastern Health and Social Care Trust. And this is in Northern Ireland. And Ed is a 5-step method practitioner and he's also a Steps to Cope founder. So welcome to Ed. And next we have Greg Nicol. Greg is the Regional Rapid Response Addiction Service Coordinator, the former Steps to Cope Coordinator at ASSERT in Northern Ireland. And next is Lorna Templeton. Lorna is an independent research consultant in England, and she's also a 5-step method and a Steps to Cope founder, trainer, and assessor. And finally, welcome to Gary McMichael, who's the Chief Executive of ASSERT in Northern Ireland. So before we begin our main panel discussion, I'd just like to turn to Ed. And Ed, tell me first of all, what is Steps to Cope and its relationship to the 5-step method?
Thanks, Joe. Well, Steps to Cope is an adaptation of the 5-step method. Now, you just can't take an adult intervention and deliver it to young people. It's got to be tested, adapted, tested again. And we've been through a period of work here in Northern Ireland to do just that. Now, we have a couple of articles published on that work, but what we found significantly was Steps to Cope helps young people. It builds their resilience. And now we're in a position to see how we can help other people, worldwide deliver it.
Great, thank you, Ed. So what I'd like to do now is ask our panel to explain what do they see as evidence of good delivery of Steps to Cope, and what does that mean both for the practitioner and the affected family member. So I'd like just to return to Ed for his thoughts.
Well, starting any intervention, what's really key is you start with warmth, engaging the young person, and help that young person have clarity to what to expect. So to have a good understanding of the entire method is crucial for the practitioner, but how you help a young person start each intervention with explaining it, setting the stage, and at the end, summarizing. And in terms of good practice, that's what's key for any intervention, how we use really good counseling skills throughout the intervention. And we use OARs, open questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summarizing. Now, they're deceptively simple. You think they're easy to do, but in practice, it takes work and you have to be comfortable with them. But those core skills helps you, young person, feel safe, feel comfortable, but keep exploring, keep talking to you.
Great, thank you, Ed. And I'd now like to move on to Greg.
No problem. Thanks very much, Jill. Okay, for me, the evidence of good delivery of Steps to Cope differs person to person, but a lot of young people, when they start the intervention, are very wary of you and not knowing really how you're going to react to their story. Once the rapport is built and there's a trust between you, however, they will start to open up. And while this can take time, it's a definite sign you're on the right track. Just seeing the openness increase and having a young person be able to talk to you about their experiences that much more than they did in the beginning, for me, this is huge. And similarly, knowing when you're discussing the likes of their coping mechanisms, having a young person's past experiences be legitimized through seeing how others have reacted to similar circumstances, and just being able to tell them that what they chose to do was okay or the right decision for them at the time. Sometimes you can visibly see the weight having been lifted off their shoulders.
Thank you very much. And I can see from what you're saying, this thing about building the relationship with the young person is critical. And both you and Ed have mentioned that, because I can imagine with the young person, it's even more important to build that trust, that warmth, and get that relationship right so that the young person feels able to cope and talk to you. Okay, thank you. So moving now on to Lorna.
Great, thanks, Jill. I think I'm going to mention two things, and I think the first thing I'm going to talk about actually builds on what Ed and Greg have been saying and what you summarised there, Jill. And I think that actually getting to know the young person, so going back from the beginning of the intervention, so getting to know the young person, particularly if a practitioner is new to working with them is really key. This may need some time over more than one session before the main steps to cope work can actually start. And it may also need the flexibility to maybe meet with a young person in a cafe or some other kind of neutral and safe space. And I think, as we're all alluding to, if the time is taken to build a trusting and safe relationship, but then to ensure that environment is consistent over the rest of the intervention, then the intervention itself seems to flow much more comfortably and effectively. And I think we also see good steps to cope practice when practitioners strike the right balance between following the model and the structure of the steps and working in a flexible way. So what do we mean, or what do I mean by each of those two things? Following through the model means working through all of the steps in turn and doing this comprehensively throughout an intervention and applying all of the skills, both the core counselling skills, which are really important, as Ed's already said, but also the skills that are specific to each of the steps. I've heard Greg actually describe the skills template as the essence of steps to cope, and I really like this way of looking at it, as it perfectly sums up the importance of the skills kind of template and of following the evidence-based approach as much as possible. But flexibility is equally important for steps to cope, and perhaps can be particularly pertinent when working with young people. And flexibility can mean a number of things for steps to cope. It can be in practical ways, such as the number, duration and frequency of the sessions, or it can mean working with a young person face to face, over the phone, or using platforms such as Teams, Skype or Zoom, or making use of the online steps to cope platform. But equally important, being flexible can mean pitching the steps to cope intervention to suit each young person and where they're at with their situation, along with things such as their age and their understanding of what's going on. And I think, just to sum up overall, if practitioners are as familiar as they can be with the intervention, again, Ed's already emphasised the importance of that, then a practitioner can competently and confidently achieve the right balance between these two things for each child or young person that they work with. And again, the intervention itself, we find, is likely to be more effective.
Great, thank you, Lorna. I think you've made some really important points there. So it's really important that practitioners do follow the structure of the 5-step and keep to that structure, but importantly, it actually needs to be really flexible to adapt to the needs of that young person. And that might be, having more than one session, or the places you meet, or what kind of online platform you use. So they're really key. So thank you very much, Lorna. Yeah. And moving on to Gary.
Well, what we have found is that in terms of maintaining the structure of the intervention, that whenever you're working with practitioners who work in youth settings, is that sometimes there can be resistance to using a structured intervention like steps to cope with young people, because some practitioners favour a more eclectic approach. So they'll take different types of tools and use them throughout an engagement process with a young person. But steps to cope is based on a sequence of steps which can be adapted to suit the circumstances, but the structure is important. And the evidence shows that when young people are engaged through steps to cope, that they're likely to complete the intervention and have better outcomes. So we have to kind of encourage practitioners to see that using it as a structured intervention is where the outcomes are going to be supported. And we've found that the interventions more easily adopted into practice by practitioners in youth settings, and the fidelity maintained when there's a buy-in at a senior level within the organisation. We developed a memorandum of understanding to support this, so that we could define what the requirements are for and the commitments are by organisations and practitioners for introducing the model and attending and the training to be able to support the intervention, and what we can provide as a partnership in order to help that be embedded within the organisation through the training, the material to support the training, ongoing support for practitioners. And so it's clear, so that the organisation is clear around what we require of them in order to be able to use the intervention effectively and implement it, but also that they can see the supports that they're being given in order to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. And that's very interesting points. We've kind of moved, isn't it, from the practitioner at the individual level to engaging with the young people to actually it's also really important to get the organisational level and support right, and building on the evidence base, collecting that information, and again sticking to the 5-step structure as the evidence base really supports good outcomes. So thank you very much for that. So what I'd now like to do is to ask everybody about what the common problems they see with the practitioner's delivery of Steps to Cope and how that can be overcome. So back over now to Ed.
Thanks, Joe. I think we've alluded to a couple of things, really important things in this clip. Planning is essential, that you use a skills template to really understand what you're there to do that particular session. That's the flexibility, working with that young person, but the skills template gives you that structure. And trust your intervention. Follow the steps in order. And I think one of the most common problems that I've seen people do, you're going to hear a lot of real challenging, difficult dilemmas for young people. Trying to fix things means you get out of sync with the 5-step method, which Steps to Cope is based on. So trust your intervention, stay with the steps, but work through that skills template to help build that sequence of using that stress strain coping model that Steps to Cope is based on. What we've seen is that builds young people's resilience. And as Gary said, young people who started the intervention were more likely to finish it. That was, I think, a really exciting, finding from our preliminary work. So trust your intervention, be prepared, but don't try to fix things.
Thanks very much, Ed. That's important points there. And also for practitioners looking at this video clip, there are a number of other video clips on the website, and one of them is all about the skills framework. So it's important that practitioners are incredibly familiar with those steps and the ordering of them, because that will lead to better outcomes. So thank you, Ed. And moving on to Greg.
Okay, thanks very much, Jill. Yeah, a frequent problem can be how practitioners go about selling Steps to Cope to a young person. For some young people, they may think that they've actually done something wrong when you try to carry out this sort of intervention with them. And this can be for a number of reasons. For example, a parent or a sibling might have actually told them as much. They may also not understand why you're not helping their family member. And while your role may not lend itself to doing that, emphasizing that just because that family member may not be getting help, it doesn't mean that the young person can't. And once a young person knows you're talking with them in order to help them, and that it's not a punishment, it's not anything that they've done wrong, this can really be a game changer for them. And changing a young person's perspective that you're there to help them, not their mother, their father, their brother or sister, whoever the family member is that's struggling with the issue, but them as an individual, because they deserve the help and because they haven't done anything wrong. This again can be huge for them.
Great, thank you very much, Greg. And yes, an important point there. But yes, I can see you're saying is that for some young people, they might think, yes, well, what's all this about? Have I done something wrong? So getting that engagement again is really vital. Thank you very much. And over to Lorna.
Great, thanks, Jill. I think I'm going to go back to something that Gary's already touched on, actually. And that's that we've seen practitioners making an assumption that a young person will not engage with a structured intervention. And as a result, they'll only use parts of the Steps to Cope approach. So they'll move straight on to the later steps, perhaps through a desire to want to try and fix things, as Ed's already raised. They might want to move from step 1 to a later step. They might jump around the steps or not take the time, even if it means doing so over more than one session, to work through each step comprehensively enough. And I think this more eclectic and ad hoc approach is something that we've seen much more with Steps to Cope than we ever have with the adult 5-step version of the intervention. But actually, in working in a more ad hoc way, practitioners aren't properly following the evidence-based approach. And has already been highlighted, our data so far from about 100 young people indicates that young people actually very much can value a structured approach. It can provide them with a routine and support that they can trust, and which for many is not what they've experienced with regards to the parental substance use and or mental health issues that they're kind of grappling with, or which doesn't align with the support that they might have experienced from services thus far before coming to Steps to Cope. But as Gary said earlier, if a young person starts a Steps to Cope intervention, then the chances are, as our data shows, that they will go on and actually complete it. And that's the case for the majority of young people that we have kind of data on. And also data from these same young people show that there are positive improvements in their resilience, findings which are what's called statistically significant, meaning that they're more likely to be as a result of the intervention rather than to have occurred kind of by chance. So I think there's a really key point coming through from all of us about following the intervention, trust the intervention, as Ed said. I think it is a really good takeaway phrase.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Lorna. Yes, so all practitioners out there, follow the evidence base and stick to 5-step. And this is the evidence back from the young people. So don't make assumptions about what work and what won't, because the evidence is really strongly here to help young people. So thanks, Lorna. And over to Gary.
Yeah, I think that the points that are being made, supports what I'm about the kind of to say, which is that around the preparation for how the intervention can be used at a practitioner level, but also at an organisational level. And I think it's important that organisations prepare for how Steps to Cope is going to be incorporated within their model of practice before they introduce it. In our own organisation, we had a team who delivered Steps to Cope as their main intervention. So whenever young people were being referred into our service, they were coming to us specifically to get support because they were living with parental alcohol or drug use. And we had a service based on the model of Steps to Cope, using Steps to Cope as the main intervention. And that all worked very well. But then whenever we went to train other practitioners in other organisations, what happened was that they were mostly engaging young people because of other issues. So they were coming to their service, being referred in for other things that were going on in the young person's life. And it was only through the engagement with the young person that the issue of that hidden harm of the parental substance use was coming out. And they then found it difficult to switch to the Steps to Cope intervention, because a lot of youth services only have a limited time frame for engagement. And they also may have requirements which are within their organisational requirements in terms of the administrative tools that they would use to support the young person. And so they've perhaps found that using Steps to Cope and the tools with Steps to Cope was maybe a bit of an add-on or maybe even a burden in terms of their current practice. However, if it's thought through at the very start and it's clear how the intervention can be incorporated into existing practice and the systems that exist within the practitioner's environment, then the staff are going to be more confident in using it. They're going to be more likely to be able to complete the intervention and be more able to measure the outcomes for the young person, because they're using the tools which we have, which run alongside the intervention to show what the outcomes are.
So thank you very much. I think that, again, what you've emphasised there is getting the organisational structure right and ensuring that practitioners feel confident about the intervention, how they're going to integrate it in their work, and as others have mentioned, following the 5 steps and following the evidence base. So I think what I'd like to do now is to thank all our panel for their thoughts. I think that's hopefully given all the practitioners out there some really good hints and tips, and using the 5-step method with young people on Steps to Cope. So thank you very much to everybody. So just to sum up some key points from our panel discussion from today. The first point was it's really vital to develop trust with the young person, and taking the time to do this is going to pay dividends it's even more vital with the young person, as sometimes there can be mistrust about what's this all about and am I to blame? So do take the time. Also, do follow the structure of the 5 steps and use the skills template. The evidence shows you will get a better outcome, and the evidence from young people validates this. Lorna in particular talked about the flexibility in the number of sessions, the length and the frequency, and where to meet, you know, whether it's outdoors in a park or at a cafe, and agreeing the type of online system to use. As ever with 5-step, do try to avoid fixing things for the young person, empower them and go at their pace. And it was also emphasised that do make sure that the young person knows they deserve help and that they've not done anything wrong. And some practitioners can make assumptions that the young person won't engage, but the evidence base is actually very strong. The evidence shows that young people do engage and they're likely to complete the work if they start it. And finally, an overarching point moving from the young person and the intervention to the organisational support. It's really vital to have the whole organisation signed up, and the systems are key to ensure that Steps to Cope is incorporated. So I hope you found this panel discussion useful, and thank you very much to everybody involved in this.